All right, friends, welcome to another edition of Justice Matters One-on-One. And I don't think I could be any more excited about today's interview because of a book that was just authored and released not too long ago. And I'm here with my friend, Barbara Bradley Hagerty. She is the author of a remarkable book that we're going to be talking about today. It's called Bringing Ben Home, and it is about the fight of one man, as assisted by a lot of folks, including Barb, to combat what we all now know was a wrongful murder conviction. So let me just start with a little bit of Barb's background. And Barb, first, let me say welcome to Justice Matters One-on-One.
I've been waiting for this moment. Thank you, Glenn.
So Barb is a journalist and an author. She was with NPR for 20 years. She's also a contributing writer at The Atlantic. She has covered the Department of Justice. She has covered religion as a reporter. And she's the author of multiple books, including the new one, Bringing Ben Home. I'm going to actually show you my advanced reader's copy, which is dog-eared to death and beaten up and gnarled on because I not only read it, but I reread it, and I've gone back to it several times. The title is Bringing Ben Home, A Murder Conviction and the Fight to Redeem American Justice. And yes, that fills my heart for a couple of reasons. One, as a former homicide prosecutor, I fought for righteous murder convictions, but also having been on the inside of the criminal justice system as a federal prosecutor for 30 years, I've seen where it's broken. I know what needs to be fixed, and I know the desperate need for reform in so many areas of our criminal justice system. So the title of Barb's book does fill my heart for a number of different reasons. The need for reform, as I've mentioned to Barb, and I'm going to take the interviewer's prerogative here as I set up the interview, the conversation we're about to have. I've often said that the need for reform involves a need to reform justice on the front end, how police investigate and decide to make arrests, and how prosecutors decide to charge or decline to charge people. We call that intake on the front end. That needs to be reformed. What also needs to be reformed is everything on the back end when folks re-enter society after serving a sentence. People we used to refer to callously as ex-cons. No, they're returning citizens. They've done what the system has asked them to do, and they are now returning citizens. And we need to reform the re-entry programs that will set those folks up for success, not failure. And let me tell you, folks, I think Barb's book, Bringing Ben Home, should stand front and center in all of those reform discussions for reasons that will become obvious when and if I ever let Barb talk. So after I had the pleasure of reading the advanced reader's copy before Bringing Ben Home was published, Barb asked me to do a blurb for the jacket. Here's what appears on the back of Bringing Ben Home. I'm quoting myself now. Quote, as someone who spent 3 decades as a trial court prosecutor, I was horrified by the casual callousness that led to many of the wrongful convictions detailed in this important, beautiful, and infuriating work. I want to ask you, how is it that you decided to become involved in Ben's case and in Ben's cause?
Well, first, I want to say thank you so much. No one has ever praised me this much. In the book, it means the world. And you were good enough to take an email from a complete stranger and let me send you the book and read it. And to have someone like you say those words just really means a lot. So thank you. So in July of 2016, I was looking for a story for the Atlantic Monthly. And I called up one of my favorite sources from my NPR days, Jim McCluskey. Jim McCluskey is kind of the founder of the modern innocence movement. He's the most important person most people haven't heard of. And I called him up and I said, Jim, tell me, you've gotten 65 people either off death row or out of prison who had life sentences. You've gotten all these people out because they were wrongly convicted. What's the case that haunts you? What's the case that keeps you up at night? And he said, well, that's easy. Ben Spencer's case. said, there's not a single day that goes by that I don't think about Ben. And then he began to tell me the story of Ben. And just very briefly, what I'll say is there are a lot of wrongful conviction stories. But what was different about Ben's, and the reason I think that I could get this story published in the Atlantic and NPR, is because this was a case where a man had been wrongly convicted. A judge declared he was innocent, and yet he continued to serve his life sentence. There was essentially no way out. So the question for me was, if a judge declaring that you're innocent isn't good enough to get you out of prison, what is? What does it say about our system? What does it say about the importance of innocence or truth? And so I took the story and I ran with it.
Being as you just shared with us that a judge declared Ben innocent, and that wasn't good enough, not even close. What I want to do, and I promise I'm not going to spend a lot of time reading my favorite passages because this would be a 10-part interview, but I want to go right to one of my favorite sentences because it touches on exactly that. And you say, Benjamin Spencer, sitting in cell Y205 in the Cofield unit, may not have known just how bleak his odds had become upon conviction. It was not personal. It was procedural. The machinery of the system was purring along smoothly, indifferent to truth, cool to the touch. I still get goosebumps, but that sort of dovetails with your observation that if a judge declaring actual innocence isn't good enough, the system just purrs along smoothly. Not personal. It's procedural.
When I proposed this story to my editor, he said, Barb, we don't do true crime stories. There has to be a larger we do ideas books. And so what I do with Ben is I use him as a narrative spine for this larger issue of how easy it is to convict an innocent person and almost impossible to get him out. And it isn't personal. And yet it is. For Ben Spencer, it is. For his family, it is. For, all sorts of people. It is, and he's not the only case. Imagine that you're 22 years old. A lot of them are law students. They're about that age. Imagine you're 22 years old. You're newly married to the love of your life. You and your wife are expecting a baby. You both have jobs. You're saving money. You want to buy a better house. You want to move out of the neighborhood and live in a really wonderful place so that you can raise your child. One day, you have a migraine headache, and so you're taking a nap to sleep it off. And you hear a knock on the door. And you look out the window as you're going to the door, and you see that it's the police. And they come in, and they say, we want to search your house. We want to talk to you about this crime that happened a few days ago. And you're like, well, I heard about it. I don't know anything about it. They arrest you. They convict you. And you are spending the rest of your life in prison. You don't see your son outside of the prison walls because he's born 2 months after you were arrested. You don't get to live out your life with your wife. You actually ask her to divorce you so that she can move on with her life. You're stuck in a maximum security prison. And what I want people to see is this happens all the time. Imagine if it was you or your brother or your father. Imagine. And that's what I'm trying to do with this book is just bring home that the system may be impersonal, but it's anything but impersonal.
So can you explain a little bit to the viewers about how Ben's trial or trials, plural, went so off course?
Right. Well, of course, as you mentioned, it begins with the investigation. So let me explain what happened with the crime. We don't really know exactly what happened because there weren't any cameras, but there was a young white executive named Jeffrey Young, and he had a clothing import business. He was about to become president of the business. So he went to work on a Sunday night because in Asia, where his clients were, or his suppliers were, it was Monday morning. So he went he would often go in on Sunday night. This was March 22nd, 1987. He went into the office and he began what police believe happened is no one saw the crime, of course, and there were no cameras. But what they believe happened is he was coming out of his office at around 9:30 that night, and one or two men, probably two, were waiting outside in the parking lot, waiting next to his BMW. And when they saw him come out, they pushed him into the office. They took his wedding ring off. They took his Seiko watch off. They took the cash out of his wallet. They hit him over the head with a blunt instrument. They cracked his skull in 5 places. They carried him up, picked him up, carried him out to his BMW, opened the trunk, put him into the trunk of the BMW, slammed it, went over the Trinity River. We're talking about Dallas now. Walked and drove over the Trinity River and took a left into the very poor neighborhood of West Dallas, which was at that point in 1987 riven with kind of the violence from the crack epidemic. And they're driving along and they look in the rearview mirror and they see that the victim, Jeffrey Young, has managed somehow to get out and fall onto the street, onto Fugit Street. They panic. They drive the BMW into an alleyway and they run away. At 3:05 in the morning, the ambulance is called eventually, and at 3:05 in the morning, Jeffrey Young dies. So now the robbery investigation has become a murder investigation. So the police went around the next morning, all around West Dallas, and interviewed everyone they could, and especially the people around the alleyway, because they would have had the best view of the perpetrators. And everyone said, no, we didn't see anything. Didn't hear anything, didn't see anything, sorry. And then something happened. A reward was offered, a $25,000 reward, which was quite a lot for the folks in West Dallas in 1987. And the reward was offered by H. Ross Perot.
Okay, wait. The Ross Perot, former presidential candidate Ross.
Not just once,
Perot.
But twice, right.
Okay,
exactly.
People probably paid attention.
Yes, they did. They did. He was a self-made billionaire. He was a big man on campus in Texas. The reason he got interested is that the victim was the son of one of his top executives, and he wanted this crime solved. So he thought the way to do this is to offer a $25,000 reward. Well, people came out of the woodwork, especially a woman named Gladys Oliver, who had a good view of the alleyway. And she called up police after this was announced. And she said, you know what? I did see the two men running away. In fact, I know who they are. They're neighbors of mine. So this wasn't a stranger on stranger identification. This was a friends or neighbor identification. And she said, the two men I saw, Ben Spencer was one of them and Robert Mitchell was the other. And then she said, I bet if you asked these 2 other young men what they saw, they might tell you something. And she gave the name the 2 other young men.
And the places my mind, as a former career prosecutor, the places my mind goes is, okay, she called. Now, listen, let me back up and say rewards can be helpful in shaking the tree and getting somebody to drop a dime, as we used to say, and contact police and tell them truthfully about what they know. But they can also be the bane of a prosecutor's existence because they can prompt false reports because people want the reward money. And what you just said, Barb, and she said, why don't you talk to these other 2 people? Are we splitting the reward money now? That's my cynical prosecutor's mind. But go ahead, please continue.
Well, 2 teenagers said, oh my goodness, we saw the exact same thing, just from different angles. And one was nearly a football field away. Now this was cloudy night, 10 o'clock at night. You're telling me that you could see someone, you could identify someone from a football field away. The other was about 89 feet away and she was 123 feet away. So a good distance away. And they said, but we saw him. So what happened is kind of what I described in my thought experiment. On March 26, 4 days after the murder, police went to Ben Spencer's house, knocked on his door, asked to search his place for the watch, the wedding ring, cash, a jam box, kind of TV, radio that was also stolen. Looking for all of those things.
Can I ask a procedural question? Did they have a warrant, or did Ben give consent to search the place?
He gave consent.
Which
right.
tells us something.
Right.
Doesn't tell us everything, but if you have nothing to hide, as the saying goes.
Right.
So go ahead.
They didn't find a murder weapon. They didn't find any of the stolen property. They didn't find any bloody clothes. Further investigation found that Ben's fingerprints were nowhere in the car, not at the office, nowhere. There was nothing actually to connect Ben to this assault. So they arrest him. Off he goes. But they had a problem, of course. And you know what the problem is. They had no one to actually connect Ben to the actual assault. I mean, he could have been, he didn't say this, but he could have found the BMW on the street and just driven it around and run away from it. We don't know, but they had no one to connect him to the assault. But happily, you'll never guess what happened. You know exactly what happened. A jailhouse snitch who was sharing a cell, jailhouse informant who was sharing a cell with Ben Spencer, went to the police, knew about the reward, asked to meet with the police, and then told them that I shared a cell with Ben Spencer, and he told me everything that happened.
Can I interject? I can't not interject because, having dealt with so many informants of all stripe, including jailhouse snitches, as you put it, one of the things that we had to do as prosecutors was test the story of anyone who came forward purporting to have a confession from his cellmate or somebody else in the confinement facility.
Well, Danny Edwards, he had a pretty wild story to tell. None of the facts were consistent with what the police believed. He said that Ben was driving the car. No, actually, the witnesses who said they saw two people in the car or running away from the car said that Robert Mitchell was driving and Ben wasn't. He said that Ben wasn't worried about being fingerprinted because he had wiped his fingerprints off on the cement. Now, Ben's fingerprints were intact. He said that Ben and his alibi witness had partied for several days. Well, no, Ben was at work the next day. His alibi witness was at school the next day. I mean, none of it was corroborated by what they thought, what the police thought. And yet they put him on, and he was the link to the assault. And with that evidence, they went, and the prosecutor went and indicted, got an indictment and tried Ben for murder and got a conviction.
And what happened after that first conviction was obtained?
Yes. Well, it's interesting. What happened is that the work of the prosecutor, I won't use an adjective right now, but the work of the prosecutor came back to haunt him. And what I mean by that is there was basically a Brady violation.
And Brady, you mentioned the Brady case, Barb, which was a Supreme Court case decided back in 1963, which said prosecutors have a constitutional obligation, given the due process rights of all defendants, to turn over information or evidence that they come upon during their investigation that could be exculpatory, that could be helpful to the defendant and his or her defense counsel in putting their case together. And, Brady, I will say in my own personal experience, Brady evidence and how we handle Brady evidence has honestly evolved over the years. But I am hopefully not being Pollyanna or naive when I assert that I do think prosecutors are getting better and better at guarding against wrongful convictions. I do tend to believe that.
In Dallas, they have an open file system.
That's a beautiful thing. And a conviction integrity unit, which is also a beautiful thing.
So at any rate, what happened is the jury had found Ben guilty, and they were out deciding the length of his sentence. And as the defense attorneys were waiting, one of them, Bruce Anton, looked over to the prosecutor's table, and there he saw a piece of paper. And the piece of paper was a receipt from Crime Stoppers. Crime Stoppers is a service in which people can call and give anonymous tips. And if those about a crime, and if those tips pan out, they actually can get reward money. Well, this one showed that Gladys Oliver, the star witness, the woman, 42-year-old woman, had received $580 from Crime Stoppers. Now, that's not a lot of money. There wasn't anything about the Ross Perot money or anything, but it was enough to show that she had lied at trial because she had sworn up and down that she received no money for the information that she gave and that she didn't expect to. And she didn't even know about a reward. So here she was, having received money from Crime Stoppers and lying about it. And the prosecutor knew about it, obviously, because it was sitting there and on his desk. And so the defense attorney took this to the judge, and the judge vacated the conviction. This was October of 1987.
And that feels like good news, and it feels like it should be perhaps the end of the
Yes, it should be the end of the story, but it wasn't, because the prosecutor's office decided that Ben should be retried. And so the original prosecutor left the office a little bit under a cloud, and they assigned another prosecutor who was really one of their best. So this prosecutor gets the case in January, and there's a trial date for March. He didn't have a lot of time to reinvestigate, so I'm actually giving him a bit of a pass here. He didn't have time to reinvestigate. He just basically did the same trial, except he didn't let Gladys lie on the stand. The weekend before, the Friday before the trial was to begin on Monday, the prosecutor comes to Ben's lawyer and says, "You know what? If Ben will plead guilty to robbery, we will ask for a 35-year sentence, but with the way things are going, he'll be out in 2 to 3 years because the prisons were overcrowded, so people were basically doing 1 month per year of their jail time." So the lawyer brings it to Ben and says, "Ben, you need to take this because this is you will be out in 2.5 years. Do your time and get on with your life." And Ben says, "But wait a minute, I didn't do this thing. I'm not going to plead guilty to something I didn't do." The lawyer says, "Look, they're going to ask for life, and they're probably going to get it, Ben." And he said, "Well, I don't care what they're going to ask for. I didn't do this thing. I'm going to go to trial." And they go to trial, and exactly what the lawyer said would happen, happened. Ben was convicted and was given life in prison.
Then there was a new chapter because another person or organization entered the picture at that point. Right. Can you explain?
Yeah, just very briefly. So this was before the Innocence Project. No one was really looking at wrongful convictions, but there were, except for one man, Jim McCluskey, the man who put me onto this story. And Jim had something called Centurion Ministries, and there was a little tiny organization, couple of paid people, and a bunch of volunteers. And what they would do is reinvestigate cases. Ben heard about them from another inmate, and in 1989 he wrote Centurion Ministries. Centurion wrote back and said, "You know what? We are just overwhelmed," because at this point they had been on 60 Minutes, profiled by 60 Minutes, the New York Times, everywhere. So they were getting hundreds of requests for help. And Ben was just one of the hundreds. And they said, we're not sure we can help you. We've got several people on death row that we think actually have a deadline, literally a deadline. And so we need to help them first. So it would be another 11 years. Ben kept writing them back and forth, saying, "Look, I know that you might not be able to help me," but this was keeping his hope alive. And finally, in 2001, Jim McCluskey went down to Cofield Prison, maximum security prison in Texas, and met with Ben. And he had reviewed the whole case. He had looked through all the trial transcripts, everything. And he had become convinced that Ben was probably innocent.